The architecture of absence, the long, quiet disappearance of Carol Lynley. The disappearance of Carol Lynley does not announce itself with the jagged edges of a mystery, and that is precisely what makes it so disturbing when viewed in retrospect. It lacks the convenient landmarks of a Hollywood tragedy. There is no single incident to investigate, no defining scandal to dissect, and no dramatic fall from grace that allows the audience to emotionally process what happened to her through the lens of a cautionary tale. Instead, her career dissolves slowly into the background, thinning over time until absence feels less like a sudden loss and more like a quiet inevitability. Hollywood is exceptionally good at creating this kind of disappearance because it does not disrupt momentum, trigger internal investigations, or require public explanation. It is a procedural erasure that operates in the shadows of the industry's relentless forward motion. And that forces us to confront an uncomfortable starting question that frames everything that follows. How many careers end not because something went wrong, but because nothing went right enough to justify continued attention from a system that demands exponential growth? The trap of reliability. Carol Lynley entered the industry at a moment when Hollywood was quietly and ruthlessly recalibrating how it treated young actresses. The old studio system was weakening, losing its iron grip on distribution, but its deep-seated instincts for control remained perfectly intact, especially when it came to women who appeared emotionally open, psychologically expressive, and easily shaped by a director's vision. Lynley transitioned from the world of high-fashion modeling into serious acting with a professionalism that made executives comfortable and directors confident. She learned the technicalities of the craft quickly, took direction without the friction of ego, and delivered performances that felt grounded in a messy reality rather than the theatrical artifice of the previous generation. This reliability made her incredibly valuable in the short term. She was the safe bet for a mid-budget drama. But Hollywood rarely plans long-term futures for actors it does not choose to mythologize. So it's worth asking early in her story, does being dependable secure longevity, or does it merely make you easier to replace when the next dependable face appears? The cost of realism. What distinguished Lynley from many of her contemporaries was not flamboyance, public rebellion, or high-gloss glamour, but a raw, almost uncomfortable emotional transparency. She often portrayed characters who seemed internally fractured, women navigating deep wells of fear, instability, repression, or psychological tension without the safety of exaggeration. Her performances invited the audience inward, asking them to sit with her in the silence, rather than demanding their attention outward with grand gestures. This subtlety made her compelling to serious filmmakers who valued nuance. But it also made her difficult to market in an era that increasingly relied on simplified, punchy star identities. Hollywood likes actors who symbolize something quickly. The rebel, the siren, the girl next door. Carol Lynley symbolized uncertainty, vulnerability, and a quiet emotional complexity that resisted easy branding. And that leads to a critical question that Hollywood rarely asks openly. What happens to actors whose strength lies in realism when the industry's survival depends on archetypes? Consistency without leverage. Despite steady work and consistently respected performances, Lynley never became what we might call institutionally protected. She was not positioned as a studio cornerstone, nor was she framed as indispensable to any long-term executive strategy. She worked consistently, but consistency without leverage is a fragile state of being. Hollywood protects its capital investments, not human effort. When risk calculations shift, whether due to changing audience tastes, internal studio politics, or emerging aesthetic trends, the people without power buffers are the first to be quietly repositioned or omitted entirely. This is where many disappearances truly begin. They do not start with a loud rejection or a no at an audition. They start with omission. They start when a name simply stops being brought up during the casting of prestige projects. So the question deepens. How many careers were shaped by decisions made in rooms where the actor's name was mentioned as an option, but never defended as a necessity? Performance versus identity. One of the most damaging and least acknowledged forces in Lynley's career was how certain performances followed her far beyond their original context. Roles that required psychological fragility and emotional instability were executed so convincingly that they became the interpretive lenses through which casting directors viewed her entire range. Instead of reading these performances as evidence of profound professional depth, parts of industry began reading them as a personal risk. Hollywood has long struggled to separate a convincing portrayal of instability from the identity of the woman performing it. If she played broken too well, the assumption was that she might be difficult to manage on set. And this raises a difficult question for viewers. When an actor disappears after playing vulnerability too well, was the problem the quality of the performance, or a system that lacked the imagination to see them beyond the trauma they depicted? The invisibility of suffering. Off-screen, Carol Lynley struggled with anxiety, depression, and substance dependence during a historical period when mental health was neither contextualized nor protected by the industry. There was no framework for support, only a cold tolerance that remained until that tolerance eventually expired. What separates her story from the loud, tragic tabloid narratives of the 1960s is the utter absence of spectacle. She did not implode on a public stage. She did not generate the kind of train wreck scandal that sells magazines and keeps a name in the headlines. She continued to work, continued to appear professional, and continued to meet the technical expectations of her contracts. But Hollywood does not reward silent endurance. It rewards the drama of the comeback or the tragedy of the fall. Without the noise of drama, suffering becomes invisible rather than sympathetic. Instead of intervention or grace, Lynley experienced something much more destabilizing: gradual professional erosion. Fewer opportunities, less narrative importance, a slower heartbeat to her career. This leads to an unsettling reflection. Is quiet suffering more dangerous in Hollywood than a visible, loud collapse? The television reassignment. As film opportunities narrowed, Lynley transitioned into the world of television, a move often described by biographers as an act of adaptation or resilience. But historical context is essential here to understand the weight of that shift. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, television was not yet a prestige arena. It was the secondary market. For a film actress of her caliber, it often signaled a quiet reassignment, a move to the periphery. She appeared in episodic roles and made-for-TV productions, remaining visible on the screen while simultaneously losing her cultural authority. She was still acting, still present in the living rooms of America, but she was no longer central to the stories that audiences remembered long after the credits rolled. This kind of survival comes with a psychological cost that is rarely acknowledged by those who only track credits on a page. So it's worth asking directly, what does it mean to keep working when the work no longer moves you forward, but merely keeps you from standing still? The logic of erosion. What makes Carol Lynley's disappearance especially revealing is how perfectly reasonable. It appeared at every individual stage. There was no single moment that felt unjust enough to spark a protest or an outcry. Each transition, from lead to support, from support to guest appearance, from appearance to mere memory, felt logically explainable by the market. Hollywood excels at making the erosion of a human career feel like a series of sensible business decisions. Because nothing dramatic or unfair occurred, no one felt compelled to interrogate the outcome. This leads to a broader and deeply uncomfortable question. How many disappearances go unnoticed by the public because they unfold slowly enough to feel like the natural order of things? We watch the tide go out so slowly that we don't realize the shore has changed until the water is miles away. The illusion of safety. Her story also exposes the profound illusion of safety that fame and work create. From the outside, Lynley appeared consistently employed, visible across various mediums, and connected to respected projects. But in the entertainment industry, employment is not the same as protection. Visibility is not the same as power. Without leverage, Without a dedicated team of advocates, and without a defended narrative, even the most talented actors can drift into obscurity without ever technically failing. This challenges one of Hollywood's most persistent and cruel myths, that professionalism and talent alone guarantee longevity. Her career suggests something far more unsettling for those who believe in meritocracy. Sometimes the system does not remove you because you failed a test, but simply because you no longer justify the risk of continued investment. Silence as erasure. As time passed, Carol Lynley's name softened in the collective cultural memory. Her work remained accessible in the archives, and her performances endured for those who sought them out, but her presence faded from the active conversation of the industry. She became recognizable without being remembered deeply, a face from a movie whose title you can't quite recall. And that incomplete remembrance may be the most telling and tragic aspect of her disappearance. She was not destroyed by a singular villain, nor was she disgraced by a public act. She was simply not defended when the fickle spotlight of public attention moved elsewhere. In an industry where attention is the only true currency, silence does not just mean a lack of noise. It functions as an active form of erasure. A procedural history. Carol Lynley's disappearance forces us to rethink how the history of Hollywood is written. We are taught to look for the great men and the tragic women, but many stories fall into neither category. Not all disappearances involve grand tragedy, explosive scandal, or a locked room mystery. Many are procedural. They are administrative. They are quiet. They happen when the perceived risk of a person outweighs the patience of the corporation, when the nuance of vulnerability outweighs the simplicity of profitability, and when no one in power feels a personal obligation to intervene. Her story asks us to look beyond the distraction of spectacle and consider how many careers faded in a gray not because of singular mistakes, but because the system quietly stopped seeing the value in sustaining them. And perhaps the most unsettling question her story leaves us with is this: how many names disappeared from our screens, not because they lacked the talent to stay, but because the industry never believed they were worth protecting once complexity entered the equation? In a culture obsessed with dramatic endings, Carol Lynley's quiet fading reminds us that the most revealing disappearances are the ones that happen while the audience is still looking the other way, distracted by something much louder.